And welcome to One Hero a Day, where everyday courage lives on. Like and subscribe to hear a new story each night. The night was still. In the narrow alleys of Hanoi's old quarter, the hum of the city had long since faded. The concrete walls held the warmth of the day, but the wind had cooled just enough for sleep to settle in. Inside the homes pressed shoulder to shoulder, ceiling fans turned lazily. Distant traffic softened into rhythm. Cats crept across rooftops. Clothes swayed gently on old lines. Tuan lay awake in the room he rented above a small coffee roaster's shop. The summer heat had retreated, but a restless tension clung to him, like a thought half-formed or a name just out of reach. He stared at the ceiling. Somewhere below, a baby stirred. A dog barked once and then went quiet. Then came a sound that didn't belong. Not sharp, not loud, just wrong. He sat up. A smell followed. Bitter, synthetic, heavy. He blinked hard, then stood. At first he thought it was a power surge. Maybe something had shorted. But then he stepped to the small balcony and looked out over the alley. And there, a faint, rising column. Smoke, slipping upward like a ribbon from a narrow home 2 doors away. He froze. No flames. Not yet. But the color of the smoke was dark, unnatural. Not cooking, not incense. Something burning deep, plastic, wiring, something buried in the walls. He heard a noise again. Muffled, then clearer. A voice. Help! Someone help! His breath caught. A man might call for help. A child might scream. But this voice, it was frail, female, raw, not loud. Almost as if the speaker couldn't afford to waste strength. Tuan didn't move at first. In that split second, there was the old instinct. Call someone. Wake the neighbors. Find help. But no one else had responded. The windows stayed dark. The silence pressed in. The smoke thickened. He moved. He didn't shout for help. He didn't grab a phone. He didn't even put on shoes. He ran toward the smoke, toward the cry, toward the unknown. The alley twisted as he moved. He ducked under hanging wires, jumped a low wall, and rounded the corner. There it was, the source. A 3-story concrete house, older than most, wedged tightly between 2 others. The ground floor shutter was closed. Smoke poured from the upper windows. A neighbor leaned out from the house across the way, holding her nose. "Is there a fire?" she called. Tuan didn't answer. He was already at the door, pulling the gate. Locked. He tried again, pulled harder. It didn't budge. Inside, something shifted, maybe furniture falling, or a ceiling fan giving out. The smoke came faster now. And then, the voice again. This time louder. Desperate. Not a word, but a gasp. A human sound, full of fear. Someone was alive. He looked up. A second-floor window glowed faintly, smoke swirling against the glass. And still, no sirens. No help. Only the night, and Tuan, and the voice behind the wall. The alley twisted upward. Tuan's feet slapped bare against the cracked cement as he scanned the facade for anything climbable. The iron gate was sealed, the main door obscured by smoke. There was no breaking it from the front. No keys. No time. The voice came again. This time rougher, hoarse. He turned toward the neighboring house, a low, patched-together structure with a tin roof and a peeling balcony just beneath the fire. No one had emerged, lights still off. Maybe no one home. He hesitated only briefly before vaulting onto a ledge, grabbing a drainage pipe with both hands and pulling himself up. The pipe groaned under his weight. The smoke thickened above him, drifting downward now like a veil. His fingers burned from rust and heat. He paused to breathe, squinting as ash stung his eyes. Then he pushed upward again, barefoot, shirt damp, breath steady. By the time he reached the second floor, the source of the smoke was no longer distant. It surrounded him. The narrow balcony outside the burning apartment was just wide enough to crouch. He dropped to it. The metal was hot under his skin. He peered in. The window was sealed. Worse, barred with old-fashioned iron grates, bolted into the frame. Behind them, nothing but gray air and shadows. Then, a flicker. Movement. A hand, weak, brushed against the glass and vanished. Tuan pressed his face close. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No answer. He pounded on the glass. Nothing. But he could hear her inside, low coughing, ragged breathing. And then he noticed something. The sound wasn't coming from the window itself. It was off to the left. A wall, plain, painted yellow, separating this building from the next. He placed his ear to it. Yes, just there, on the other side. He looked down again. The alley had drawn a small crowd now, maybe 10 people watching, filming. One shouted, "Get down!" The building could go, but the cry inside was louder in his mind. He dropped back to the neighboring balcony and climbed down fast, heart hammering. A few neighbors tried to stop him, but he slipped past, running barefoot toward a pile of construction scrap nearby. He dug through rusted metal, broken bricks, and tangled rebar until his fingers found the handle of a claw hammer, old but intact. He gripped it tight, turned, and ran back toward the climb. The shouts followed him. Someone had called the fire department. Sirens, faint and distant, began to rise behind the rooftops, but not fast enough. He climbed again, slower now, carrying the tool, lungs beginning to sting. At the top, he crouched against the hot concrete wall. With his free hand, he touched it. It vibrated faintly, not from machinery, but from life. Someone breathing, coughing, just inches away. Tuan swallowed hard. He pressed his palm flat, then whispered through the smoke, "I'm coming in. Please stay awake." Then he raised the hammer. The first swing did little. Concrete doesn't break easily. The second, louder. Dust scattered. He gritted his teeth. The third, louder still. The noise echoed up the walls. From below, more shouts. He couldn't make out what they were saying. It didn't matter. He struck again and again. Sparks flew where metal scraped stone. The wall resisted, then began to chip. Inside, he thought he heard something. Movement? A voice? It drove him harder. Each swing was slower now, arms aching, breath ragged. But the wall began to crack, a hairline fracture, a crumbling edge, then a hole the size of his fist, then larger. Smoke burst from the gap, hot and choking. He turned his head, coughed hard, eyes watering, but didn't stop. He drove the hammer again, smashing concrete and plaster and paint. The hole widened, just enough for air to pass. Through it, he glimpsed something. Not fire, not light, but skin. An arm, trembling, she was there, still breathing. He closed his eyes for half a second, then raised the hammer once more. Concrete dust floated in the air like ash from an old memory. Tuan blinked, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and kept swinging. His fingers were raw now. The hammer, once just a tool, had become an extension of his will, rising and falling in rhythm with his heartbeat. He could no longer hear the crowd. The roar in his ears came from inside, from the effort, from the heat, from fear. The hole widened, each strike shaking loose more fragments. Then something unexpected. A cough from within, sharper this time, followed by a voice, faint but clear. "I'm here." He froze, not out of fear, out of recognition. That voice, alive, fighting just behind the wall. Not a ghost or a final breath, but a person. Tuan leaned forward, pressing his face to the rough opening. "Don't move. I'm going to get you out." A pause. Then, through the smoke and broken stone, a single word. "Okay." Her voice was thin, almost childlike. She was trying to be strong, but the panic clung to her words. The hammer dropped with a thud to the balcony floor. He reached in. Not far, just far enough to feel the heat from inside and the flutter of her breath. Too small. The hole was too small. He picked the hammer up again. This time he didn't just strike. He tore. He ripped at the crumbling concrete with his hands, ignoring the jagged edges. Skin peeled back. Blood smeared. Still, he kept going. Beneath the old wall was a metal mesh, half corroded. He bent it back with the claw of the hammer, straining with both arms. It shrieked in protest, then gave way. The hole was now wide enough for a head and shoulders, but barely. He coughed again, deeper this time. The smoke was heavier. The light from the alley was fading, blotted out by the haze. Tuan knew what that meant. The fire below was rising. He shouted through the opening, "Can you crawl toward me?" A pause, then movement. First a shadow, then a hand, small, trembling, fingers shaking, then a face. She was maybe 40. Eyes red, skin pale under soot, hair clinging to her cheeks. Tuan held out his hand. She grabbed it weakly. "Try," he said. She nodded, tried to rise, then sank again. "I can't," she whispered. He looked down. She was lying in what had once been a bedroom, now thick with black smoke. A mattress still smoldered behind her. Flames glowed faintly through cracks in the floorboards. No time. He dropped the hammer again, braced himself on the balcony ledge, and reached both arms in. "I'm going to pull you." She didn't resist. Her body was limp, not from fear, from exhaustion. She had been awake too long, breathing poison, holding on without help. He took her under the arms, careful of the jagged edges, and pulled. At first, nothing. Then she moved, inch by inch, scraping forward. Her shoulder caught on the concrete. She cried out. "Keep going," he said, voice steady. "You're almost there." He adjusted his grip. Blood from his hands smeared her sleeves. He didn't notice. With one final pull, her head emerged, then her chest. He shifted his body, leaning back, using gravity. The moment her legs cleared the wall, they both collapsed. A tangle of limbs on the balcony, coughing, gasping. For a second, they didn't move. Just lay there side by side, eyes open to the smoke-gray sky. Then from below, cheers. Not loud, not many. Just a few voices, breaking the silence with disbelief. Tuan sat up. The woman turned her head slightly toward him. You came through the wall?" He smiled. It was the only door left. She blinked, tears cutting streaks through the ash on her cheeks. Below, someone shouted, "Can you bring her down?" He looked around. The smoke was thicker now. The fire was beginning to lick the edge of the roof. No time to wait for ladders. No safe stairwell. He stood slowly, steadying himself. "We have to get down," he said. She nodded faintly. He looked at the wall again. The way he'd come up, the ledges, the pipe, the narrow alley waiting below. He had climbed up for her. Now he had to find a way to bring her down. Tuan tightened his grip around her shoulders. The balcony beneath them creaked with heat. The neighboring rooftop, tin and rust, shimmered as if melting. There wasn't much time. Not for plans, not for fear. "Hold on to me," he whispered. She nodded again, weaker this time. Tuan scanned the descent. The way up had been narrow, brutal, pipes, ledges, gaps. But now, with another person in his arms, it looked impossible. Still, he had no choice. He adjusted her arms around his neck. She winced, but didn't cry out. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was small, but not weightless. Her body sagged with fatigue. He lifted her slowly, inch by inch, bracing her against the wall, then turned and lowered both their bodies toward the first step of descent. His bare feet sought the pipe he had climbed earlier. It burned. He hissed through clenched teeth, then shifted, bracing against a small, cracked windowsill. The wind shifted. The smoke cleared just enough to reveal the drop. 2 full stories. The alley swayed in heat below. A murmur rose from the ground. People were pointing now. Some had tears on their faces. One older man clutched his chest, whispering a prayer. Tuan took the first step down. The pipe groaned. He gripped tighter, one arm around her waist, the other holding the iron. Each step was like walking through boiling fog. The tin roof beside him had buckled. Heat waves rippled across it. He paused on a small bracket of concrete. "Just a little more," he whispered to her. She didn't respond. Her head rested against his shoulder, eyes fluttering. He moved again. This time the pipe gave slightly, not enough to break, but enough to terrify. Tuan slid lower, seeking another foothold. It came, a metal beam from a forgotten scaffold. He placed one foot, then both, shifting her weight as gently as he could. Then, a shout from below. A young man had appeared with a ladder, too short to reach them, but just enough to cover the last drop. Tuan nodded toward him. "Hold steady!" The man braced it against the wall. "We've got you!" Tuan turned back to her. Almost there. Step by slow, shaking step, he climbed downward. Sweat soaked his back. Smoke clung to his lungs. The hammer wound on his hand pulsed with every movement. Then, the final drop. He lowered her onto the top rung of the ladder. Hands reached up. Arms steadied her. A gasp rose from the crowd. She was safe. Tuan followed. When his feet touched the ground, there was no applause. No cheering, just a silence, wide, stunned, full of held breath. Then, gently, a voice. "Is he okay?" He turned, looked at her. She was sitting on a stool now, breathing through an oxygen mask someone had fetched. Her eyes locked on his. He gave a nod, small and tired, then finally allowed himself to sit. The fire behind them cracked louder now. The top floor had given way. Sirens grew louder. Close now, too late for the rescue, but just in time for the aftermath. A hand touched his shoulder. He looked up. An older woman, a neighbor, placed a water bottle in his hand. She didn't speak, just pressed it gently and stepped back. The woman he'd saved spoke again, removing the mask for a moment. "My name is Kolan," she said. "I didn't think anyone would hear me." Tuan looked at her for a long second. "I didn't hear," he replied quietly. "I felt." She nodded, as if understanding something that didn't need words. Above them, the fire team began their work. Too late to change what had burned, but not too late to keep it from spreading. Tuan sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle. Smoke curled above the rooftops, and the quiet of the Hanoi night slowly returned, carrying with it a story that would soon ripple through the city like wind through drying laundry. But for now, there were no headlines. Just 2 people who had come back through the wall. Morning came slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet left behind. The sky was gray, heavy with the scent of smoke and wet ash. Tuan stood barefoot on the sidewalk, watching firefighters pack up their hoses. The crowd had thinned. The excitement had faded into silence, the kind that follows something big, something real. He hadn't said much. Neighbors approached, thanked him. Some patted his back. Others took selfies, though he barely registered them. A man offered shoes, a woman a towel. He nodded, grateful, but still not fully there. His ears still rang. His hands still bled. Shallow cuts from the wall, now crusted over with dry concrete and dust. He sat eventually on the curb, elbows on knees, head down. Ko-lan was gone, taken by ambulance once her breathing steadied. No one knew where yet. Tuan hadn't asked. He wasn't sure he was ready. For a while, he just sat. Then someone sat beside him. A boy, maybe 10, maybe younger, holding a paper cup of soy milk. He didn't speak, just set it gently on the ground next to Tuan, then stood and walked away. Tuan looked at it, then up at the buildings, blackened windows, scorched balconies, wires dangling like burnt thread. He had no idea how long he'd been awake. A motorbike pulled up nearby. Familiar. It was Dewey. His cousin swung off the seat before the engine stopped. "What the hell happened?" he asked, eyes wide, voice still breathless. Tuan managed a tired smile. She was inside. "You went through the wall, bro." Tuan looked away. "I didn't think. I just..." Dewey crouched beside him. "You're on every phone in this neighborhood. Facebook, TikTok, all over." Tuan shook his head. "That's not why I know," Dewey said quickly, softer now. "I know that's not you." They sat in silence for a while. Then Tuan asked, "Can we go see her? The woman?" Dewey nodded. "I asked around. She's at Tannan Hospital. Burn ward. Not serious." Tuan stood slowly. His body ached in ways he hadn't expected. Not just his arms or legs, but something deeper, like the strain of carrying fear for too long. As they rode through the early streets, past wet markets setting up for the day, the clatter of metal gates, and sleepy vendors arranging fresh herbs, Tuan's thoughts drifted to the moment he heard her cough, to the voice behind the wall, to the way everything stopped except for that. When they reached the hospital, the lobby was quiet, too early for visiting hours, but Dewey knew someone who knew someone. Within minutes, they were upstairs, walking slowly through a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and steam. Room 407. Tuan hesitated at the door, then knocked lightly and pushed it open. Ko-lan was awake, propped against a pillow. Her face cleaner now, but pale. Her left arm was wrapped, a bandage along her temple. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, nothing moved. Then she smiled, small, tired, real. "You came." Tuan nodded, stepping inside. "How are you feeling?" "Lucky," she said. He sat beside the bed. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman behind the wall, but as a person. She was a retired school teacher, it turned out. Lived alone, no children. That night, she had fallen asleep with incense burning. She never thought it would reach the curtains. "I didn't think anyone would hear," she said again. "I didn't hear," Tuan repeated gently. "I felt." There was quiet. Then she said something that stayed with him long after. "Sometimes we live our whole lives thinking no one will come. But one person is enough. Just one." He looked at her, then out the window, where the city moved, indifferent and beautiful. He didn't feel like a hero, just a person who had knocked on a wall and listened. The days that followed unfolded like slow waves, each one softer yet deeper than the last. News of the rescue spread faster than Tuan could have imagined. What began as a clip, a grainy phone recording of him climbing back down with Ko Lan in his arms, became something more. Chang Trai Go Tuong Ku Nguoi, the captions read. Some called him a hero. Others simply asked, "Who is he?" But Tuan avoided the noise. He didn't check his phone, didn't scroll. The world was suddenly loud, but inside him, everything had gone quiet. He went back to work at the coffee shop on Tran Hung Jiao. The owner, Uncle Ba, had kept his job open. "Customers keep asking about you," he said, chuckling. "They want their coffee with a side of courage." Tuan just smiled. He still brewed the same fin filters, still wiped the tables, still folded napkins with the same soft corners. But something had changed, not in the way people looked at him, but in how he noticed them. The quiet man who came every morning for iced black coffee now seemed older, wearier. The young woman on her phone near the window, she wiped her eyes when she thought no one saw. The world had always been full of stories. He just hadn't known how to listen. One afternoon, a group of students came in. They whispered, pointed gently. One stepped forward and asked for a selfie. Tuan hesitated, then nodded. The photo was quick, but the smile lingered. That evening, he stopped by the hospital again. This time, Ko Lan was in a wheelchair, being pushed by a nurse down the corridor. She was recovering well. Minor burns, light smoke damage. "You're becoming famous," she said with a wry smile. "I didn't mean to." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." They sat in the courtyard together, where the trees threw long shadows across the concrete, and the air still held the scent of wet bamboo. Ko Lan shared more of her story. She had been a literature teacher. Decades of poetry, essays, quiet students with loud hearts. She had once taught at the school down the street from Tuan's childhood home. "Maybe I taught you," she said playfully. "Maybe I skipped that day," he replied. They laughed gently. Then came a silence that felt full, not empty. "I've lived alone for years," she said after a while. "Not lonely, just separate. I thought if something ever happened, no one would come." Tuan didn't respond. He just looked at her, and something softened behind his eyes. That night, he walked home along the railway tracks, the ones that ran just behind his apartment, humming gently under the weight of night trains. He thought about how fragile things were, a wall, a voice, a choice, and how sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Fame, even the quiet kind, has a strange weight. It slips into corners of your life you didn't expect, not with noise, but with whispers. Within a week, Tuan's name appeared on local news websites, small at first. A feel-good story tucked between politics and sports. But it grew. The headline photos showed a blurred figure on a wall, smoke in the background, and captions like, "Ngoi hung tam lang gua bien lua." The neighborhood cafe filled more quickly now. Customers lingered, stealing glances. A TV crew called the shop, then another. A woman from a radio station waited 3 hours just for a quote. Uncle Ba, ever the pragmatist, began adding Tuan's rescue blend to the menu. "It's just your usual dark roast," he admitted, "but it sells better now." Tuan laughed softly, but it didn't sit right. He didn't want to be on mugs or posters. He hadn't acted for attention. The moment had come, and he had responded. That was all. One night, a man came in wearing a business suit and too much cologne. He introduced himself as from a local media agency. "You've got heart," the man said. "Authenticity. We could build a brand around that." Tuan looked at him blankly. "Brand?" "Sure," the man smiled, leaning in. "Inspiration." YouTube channel, speaking gigs, maybe even merch. Hero shirts, you know. Tuan stood. I just made coffee, he said quietly. The man laughed, missing the point. Tuan left early that night. He wandered the lakeside road, where the air cooled and dragonflies skimmed the water. Around Hote, the city slowed down. Lovers sat on scooters. Elders walked slowly with hands behind their backs. He breathed easier here. At home, his mother called. She had seen him on the news. Bo kon kung tung kun goi, she said quietly. Kong I biet, nung me biet, vagio kon kung de. Tuan sat still for a long time after the call ended. The silence felt like something sacred. Later, he walked to the rooftop. He stood near the wall, now patched with soot and memory. The hammer lay in a corner, blackened, but still whole. He placed his hand on the bricks again. This time, no one called out, but he listened anyway. Because once you've truly heard someone from the other side of the wall, you never stop listening. The rain came suddenly without thunder, just a soft shift in the air, warm, turning cool, then the first drops on the window panes. Tuan watched it fall from the cafe, one hand resting on the counter, the other tracing slow circles in the condensation of a glass. There weren't many customers that afternoon, just a couple in the corner, sharing a plate of sunflower seeds, and an old man sleeping upright near the back. The city had taken a breath, and so had he. Dewey walked in, shaking water from his shoulders. I brought something, he said. From his bag, he pulled out an envelope, thick, official-looking. What's this? Tuan asked. Commendation letter from the district police. They want to recognize you publicly, medal and everything. Tuan sighed. I didn't do it for that. I know, Dewey said, but maybe it's time to let people say thank you. Tuan didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the envelope. Inside was a printed letter, bold header, government seal, his name in the center. The words praised his bravery, quick action, and civic responsibility. It felt distant, written in a language too formal to touch what had really happened. But then he saw it, a handwritten note at the bottom, barely legible. Thank you for listening when no one else could. Lieutenant Kwong. Tuan stared at it for a while. Do you remember, he asked Dewey slowly, when we were kids, and the house next door caught fire? Dewey nodded. You climbed onto the shed roof, tried to break the window. I was 8. You broke your arm, Tuan smiled faintly. I remember thinking, if I just hit hard enough, someone would answer. They sat quietly. Then Dewey added, You've always been like this. You just didn't always know it. Later that night, Tuan visited his mother again. Her apartment was quiet, filled with the scent of star anise and drying lemongrass. Old family photos lined the hallway. His father in a soldier's uniform, his mother in an ao dai, Tuan as a toddler clutching a red balloon. They had dinner in silence, the way people do when words aren't needed. Afterwards, his mother opened a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. It was a hammer. Not the one he'd used during the rescue. This one was older, wooden-handled, the kind carried by electricians and construction workers. It was your father's, she said. He carried it with him everywhere. Tuan ran his fingers along the grip. It felt worn, familiar. He once told me, she continued, if I ever knock, it's because I believe someone's there. Tuan looked at her, the weight of understanding settling slowly. Some things aren't taught, they're inherited. He walked home under the dim glow of street lamps, the hammer wrapped in cloth beneath his arm. That night, he dreamed of walls again. But this time, they were not burning, they were listening. By the end of the second week, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't just Tuan who had changed. It was the way people moved around him. Not with awe or distance, but with a quiet recognition, like they now carried some invisible thread of the same fire. He noticed it most at the morning market. Vendors who once barely nodded now greeted him with warm eyes. A teenager handed him an extra banh mi without charge. Even the silent security guard at the corner bank offered a small salute one morning. Stiff, a little awkward, but sincere. Tuan never got used to it. He didn't want to. But something else grew in that space. Responsibility. It started with an old woman who tripped at the bus stop. No one moved until Tuan did. Then 3 others followed. They helped her up, dusted her coat, made sure she was all right. She looked at him and smiled. "You make people believe again," she said. He didn't know what to say. At the coffee shop, a new customer came in. Middle-aged, nervous hands, eyes darting around. He asked for a black coffee, then stayed for 2 hours, scribbling in a notebook. Before leaving, he approached Tuan quietly. "I was there," he said. "That night." Tuan paused. "At the fire?" The man nodded. "I didn't help. I froze. I've been ashamed since." Tuan looked at him, saw the trembling in his shoulders. "You stayed," Tuan said softly. "You remembered." The man's eyes welled. Later, after the shop had closed, Tuan sat alone at table 4, the one near the window, where light caught the glass just right. He thought about the difference between action and witness, between showing up and stepping forward. One did not cancel the other. The city moved outside like breath, steady, unhurried. Tuan watched the silhouettes of motorbikes against a sky streaked with neon and mist. He thought of all the people who had watched that night, who had recorded or panicked or simply stood still, and he no longer blamed them. Everyone has their moment. His just happened to come with fire. But now, he wondered, what next? A knock at the door broke the thought. It was Ko Lan, in a wool coat and wide-brimmed hat. She looked older than before, but stronger too. She smiled. "I was passing by." Tuan ushered her in, made her a warm glass of lotus tea. They sat again, the same way they had at the hospital courtyard. "I'm moving," she said quietly. "Too many memories in that place." He nodded. "Understandable." "But before I go," she added, "I wanted to give you something." From her bag, she pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound, faded at the edges. "It's my journal," she said. "I started it the day I retired. Thought it might help me feel useful. I wrote every day, until the fire." Tuan took it gently. Unsure, she smiled. "Maybe you'll write the rest." Outside, the rain had begun again, slow and steady, washing the dust off the rooftops. Tuan held the journal in both hands. Another wall, another voice, and this time, she had chosen to knock. The halfway point never feels like halfway. It feels like a question. For Tuan, that question arrived one early morning, before the sun had fully risen, in the quiet hours when Hanoi still slept under its blanket of mist. He sat at his usual spot by the window, the leather-bound journal from Ko Lan resting on his lap. He had read it all. Some entries were brief, just a sentence or two about a flower on the balcony or the neighbor's noisy cat. Others were pages long, meditations on age, loneliness, the feeling of becoming invisible in a city that never stops moving. Tuan saw himself in those pages, and he saw his father. One entry stopped him cold. There is a kind of bravery in staying, in watering the plants, in keeping the light on when no one knocks. He closed the book and stared out at the light breaking over the railway line. The tracks shone silver, like veins leading somewhere he couldn't yet name. That day at the cafe, 2 journalists came by, one Vietnamese, one French. They asked for an interview. Tuan hesitated. He still wasn't comfortable speaking about the fire. It felt impersonal, abstract, like telling a story he hadn't fully lived yet. But he agreed. They asked thoughtful questions. What did you feel in that moment? Why did you act when others didn't? He answered as best he could, quietly, truthfully. But then the French journalist leaned forward, her voice low. Do you think you saved her life, or just postponed the inevitable? The question hit him like cold water. He paused. The room grew still. I didn't think about that, he replied. I only knew she was alive in that moment, and that was enough. They nodded, scribbled, thanked him, but the words lingered long after they left. That night, Tuan walked aimlessly, past the lake, past the lit-up banks and the karaoke bars, deeper into alleys where the city spoke in whispers. He ended up at the old apartment again. It had been boarded up now. Ash still clung to the eaves. The smell of smoke was long gone, replaced by wet plaster and mildew. But the memory remained, embedded in the walls like soot in old cloth. Tuan stood there a long time. A boy passed by on a bicycle, slowed, then looked up. It's you, he said. From the fire. Tuan nodded. The boy leaned his bike against a tree. My sister lives nearby, he said. She was scared for weeks after that. But now, every time she hears knocking, she runs to open the door. He smiled. She says, maybe it's the hammerman. Tuan couldn't help it. He laughed. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was release, the kind that shakes something loose inside you. He walked home lighter, and that night, before bed, he opened the journal again. On the first blank page, he began to write. There are days when I still feel the heat, but most days, I feel the silence after. And I've learned that silence is not empty. It's where everything begins again. The city had returned to its rhythm. Mornings filled with the clatter of chopsticks in pho stalls, afternoons humming with traffic, school bells, and vendors calling out prices. Nights thick with the scent of grilled meat and the soft clang of ice in coffee glasses. But something was different. People still came to the cafe, some for the coffee, some just to see him. But more and more they came with stories. A woman spoke of a neighbor she hadn't talked to in years, until the fire reminded her how thin the walls truly were. She brought over rice and ginger tea. They spoke for the first time in a decade. A teenage boy confessed to skipping school often, but after hearing what Tuan did, he started volunteering at a local shelter. I don't know why, he said. It just felt like maybe I should be ready for something. Even Dewey, ever skeptical, had begun asking different questions, not just about customers or profits, but about meaning, about what they were building here and why. Tuan listened. He never saw himself as a symbol, but now he understood. People weren't looking at him. They were looking through him, toward something they'd forgotten they could be. It was humbling. One evening, a group of university students came in. They ordered coffee, found a corner table, and began sketching ideas on paper. After a while, one approached. We're designing a safety app, she explained. Real-time alerts for fires, traffic blockages, medical aid, that sort of thing. You inspired it. Tuan blinked. Me? You reminded us that we can do something, even small things. She handed him a page, a rough logo, a flame turning into an ear. We're calling it Lang Nghe. Listen. Tuan stared at it. I don't know what to say, he murmured. She smiled. You already said it. That night. With your hands. With the wall they left shortly after, laughing among themselves. The cafe grew quiet again. Tuan looked down at the logo, a flame becoming an ear, a sound becoming action. Later that night, he added another line to the journal. Courage is not the flame. It's what happens when someone else sees it and carries the warmth forward. Outside, the streets dimmed into shadow, but somewhere someone was drawing closer to the wall, and maybe this time, they'd hear a knock. The monsoon came early that year. It swept across Hanoi like a long breath held too long, flooding gutters, soaking the scent of street food into the air, draping clotheslines in silence. The city didn't pause for it, not really, but it did move slower. So did Tuan. The cafe was quieter. Customers lingered, but fewer came. Rain muffled the usual clatter. The world shrank to the space of a few feet. The counter, the window, the sound of his own thoughts. One afternoon, Uncle Ba found him staring at the old hammer again. You thinking of your father? He asked gently. Tuan nodded. He was a quiet man, Ba continued, but not small. People think you need noise to be big. He placed a hand on Tuan's shoulder. You're more like him than you know. That night, Tuan asked his mother for stories. They sat on the floor of her apartment, a pot of warm chai between them, and opened old photo albums, yellowed pages, peeling corners, memories worn soft by time. She told him about the first time his father fixed a broken fan in the neighbor's house, about the time he pulled a boy from a flooded street during a typhoon, about how, during his final year, he kept a notebook of small kindnesses he'd witnessed, left behind, unfinished. She gave that notebook to Tuan, only a dozen pages filled. One read, Young girl gave her seat to a limping man. Another, shopkeeper returned extra change. No one noticed but me. Tuan turned the last page, blank. He traced his finger across it. The silence of something begun, but not completed. He brought the notebook home, placed it next to Ko Lan's journal. 2 lives, 2 voices, 1 thread. The next morning, he opened to that final page and wrote. He listened too, even when no one knew it. And suddenly, Tuan saw the fire in a new light, not as the beginning of his story, but as its continuation. The hammer, the listening, the knock. These were not new. They were inherited, passed not just through blood, but through silence, through waiting, through watching others suffer and choosing to step toward them. Outside, the rain softened. He looked toward the rooftop. The wall was still there, and somewhere behind it, so was his father. The invitation arrived in a plain white envelope. No logo, no signature, just a typed line. Community Forum on Civil Courage. Panel request, Mr. Nguyen Tuan. Tuan almost didn't open it, but curiosity or something deeper pulled him in. It was from the Youth Cultural House, a local hub for talks, workshops, quiet activism. They were hosting a forum about ordinary bravery, people stepping up when systems stalled. Someone had nominated him. They asked him to speak. Just 10 minutes. Share what happened. Reflect on it. He stared at the letter for a long time. When he told Due, his friend raised an eyebrow. 10 minutes? You've done harder things. Tuan laughed. Speaking isn't the same as knocking on a wall. Dewey grinned. Maybe. But this time the wall talks back. The day of the forum, Tuan arrived early. The hall was simple. Rows of plastic chairs, a small stage, and a folding table where panelists would sit. No press, no fanfare, just people. The room filled slowly. Mothers with children, young professionals in pressed shirts, students with notebooks. Some faces Tuan recognized. Most he didn't. He sat beside two others, a retired nurse who once performed CPR in a marketplace, and a taxi driver who helped evacuate a flooded hospital during a storm. The moderator, a woman with a warm voice, welcomed them all. Tonight we listen to the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines, but stays in memory. When it was Tuan's turn, he stood behind the mic, heart pounding in his throat. He began with the words he had written in Ko Lan's journal. "There are days when I still feel the heat." He spoke slowly, about the knocking, about the choice not to walk away, about the silence afterward. He didn't talk about the medal. He didn't mention the interviews. Instead, he spoke of Ko Lan's voice, how fragile it had sounded behind the plaster, and how the real miracle wasn't that she was saved, but that she answered, that people still answered. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then came applause. Not thunderous, but steady, real. Afterward, people came up one by one, some with tears, some just nodding. But one man stood out. He was older, wore a green army jacket, and held a photo in his hand. A black and white picture of a young man in uniform, hammer on his belt. "My brother," the man said. Tuan's breath caught. "Was your father named Nguyen Van Kai?" "Yes," Tuan whispered. The man smiled. "Then we're family. Distant, but real." They talked until the janitor began turning off lights. The man shared stories of Tuan's father from years before, how he once helped rebuild a collapsed bridge in the north, how he trained young workers not just with tools, but with values. He used to say, the man added, "Build what you wish they'd leave you." Tuan wrote that down when he got home, another brick in the growing wall of memory. Not the kind that blocks, but the kind that shelters. That night, Tuan didn't dream of fire. He dreamed of wood, of walls being built, strong, open, and full of doors. The idea began as a whisper. It started with Dewey, of course. One evening, after closing up the cafe, he turned to Tuan with a wild glint in his eye. "You ever thought about teaching?" Tuan raised an eyebrow. "Teaching what? How to bang on walls?" Dewey laughed. "Not exactly, but what if we made something out of this? A kind of local preparedness group. Neighborhood level, real skills, real response." Tuan paused. "You mean like a class?" "Not a class," Dewey said. "A movement." That word felt too big. But 2 weeks later, they held the first gathering. Just 12 people, a mix of neighbors, customers, cousins. They met on the cafe's second floor, with folding chairs and a borrowed whiteboard. Tuan stood in front, nervous. But once he began, once he spoke about fire safety, situational awareness, how to read danger not with panic but with calm, the words flowed. He wasn't teaching heroism. He was teaching attention. Each session grew, from 12 to 20, then 30. Soon they moved to the community center. They called it Nguoi Gung Kwa, the door knockers. The idea caught on. They added first aid sessions, evacuation drills, sessions for teens and elders. A woman from the fire department joined. Then a retired EMT. Then a school principal offered classroom space. People came not just to learn, but to listen and to remember. One night, a woman stood up at the end of a session. Her voice trembled. "I was in a fire once," she said. "No one came. I survived by jumping. Silence. But now, when I hear about you, all of you, I don't feel angry anymore. I feel seen. Another man added, my son never used to speak in groups. Now he practices escape plans with his cousins. Tuan listened, heart heavy in the best way. They weren't just building a program, they were rebuilding trust, rewriting what neighborhoods could mean. Late one night, long after everyone had gone, he stayed behind to clean up. He looked at the rows of empty chairs, the water bottles left on the table, the faint chalk lines on the board. It all felt real now. Not a memory, not a fluke, a foundation. He wrote in his father's notebook. He built bridges. I build rooms. Same wood, same hands. And on the last page, he finally added, this is how we stay ready. Not for the worst, but for each other. Outside, in a dozen homes, someone was checking their smoke alarm. And maybe somewhere, a young boy was listening closely to the shape of silence behind the wall. It happened on a Tuesday. Ordinary, uneventful, or so it seemed. Tuan was at the cafe, restocking the shelves with Due, when a message lit up on his phone. It was a video link, sent by Lin, one of the university students who had created the Langange app. He tapped it open. A local news segment. The anchor's voice was calm, measured. This week, a 7-year-old girl in Jianeng was rescued from a house fire after her neighbor heard tapping from the other side of a shared wall. The neighbor, a high school student, had recently attended a neighborhood safety session modeled on a Hanoi program called Ngoy Gon Kua. Tuan froze. The video cut to footage of the scorched house, then to an interview with a boy, maybe 16, nervous, shoulders hunched. I remembered the story of the man who used a hammer to knock through the wall, he said. I didn't have tools, so I used a chair leg. I didn't know if anyone would hear, but he looked down, then up again. I couldn't walk away. Tuan stood in silence. Dewey leaned over, watched the last few seconds, then whispered, "You see what you did?" Tuan shook his head slowly. "I didn't do that. He did." But his voice cracked slightly. That night, the story spread. Social media lit up with messages, not praise, but reflections. Others sharing times they had acted, times they hadn't, and wished they had. Neighborhood groups began tagging Ngoy Gon Chua, asking for materials, asking how to host their own sessions. Tuan received invitations to cities he'd never been, from schools, youth centers, even the National Firefighters Union. He didn't say yes to everything, but he said yes to enough. He traveled, quietly, carefully, spoke not as a hero, but as someone who had listened and acted, who still learned, who still got scared. One night, in a coastal village, he told the story again, not of the fire, but of the silence, of the wall, and of the voice that answered back. When he finished, a child in the front row asked, "What if you knock and no one answers?" Tuan bent slightly. "Then you keep knocking," he said gently, "because even if you don't hear them, they might be waiting for you." Later, on the bus home, he pulled out the 2 notebooks, Kolan's and his father's, and looked at the pages again. He smiled at how different the handwriting was, how similar the words had become. Fame, even the quiet kind, has a shadow. At first it came softly, a few online comments questioning the timeline. A blurry photo of Tuan outside the burned house, paired with captions that doubted. Why was he there with a hammer anyway? Then came the harsher voices. He did it for attention. No one just happens to have a hammer and a hero complex. He probably started the fire himself. It stung. Not because they were right, but because Tuan hadn't prepared for the cold that follows praise. The way strangers, from behind screens, could undo truth with nothing but suspicion. He tried to ignore it, but then a reporter reached out, not for a profile, but an exposé, asking for records, timestamps, building blueprints. The tone was sharp, eager, looking for holes. Tuan didn't respond. He didn't want to fight a narrative built on doubt. Instead, he walked. Back to the alley behind the apartment building. Back to the wall. The repairs had long been made, the scorched tiles replaced, the smoke stains painted over. But Tuan knew where the line had been. He stood there for a long time, until an elderly man, someone Tuan didn't know, approached with a small box. "You're the one from the fire," the man said. Tuan hesitated, unsure of which version the man believed, but the man just smiled. "My niece was saved by your training. She teaches at a school now. This is from her students." Inside the box were handwritten notes, simple ones. "Thank you for being brave. You taught us to knock if we're scared. You make walls feel safe." Tuan swallowed hard. When he returned to the cafe, Dewey was waiting. "They'll always question," Dewey said, "but you know the truth, and so do the people who matter." That night, Tuan added something to Ko Lan's journal. "Not everyone will believe you knocked out of love, but some will feel the echo and knock back." And then he made a choice: to keep teaching, to keep speaking, not to defend himself, but to remind others that action is not about being seen, it's about being true. The next day, he led another session. Started with a question. "What would you do?" he asked the room, "if no one ever thanked you?" The room was silent. Then a young woman answered, "I'd still knock." The phone call came late, nearly midnight. Tuan was reading by the window, a steady rain blurring the city outside. The number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer, but something made him press accept. A pause, then a voice, thin, raspy, trembling at the edges of memory. "Is this Tuan?" His breath caught. "Yes," he said softly. "This is Ko Lan." Silence filled the line, not empty, but full, as if every word she'd held back since that day was gathering its courage. "I heard about your group," she said. "I've been watching, quietly. I'm proud of you." Tuan didn't speak right away. He closed his eyes, let the name settle in. Ko Lan. He hadn't spoken to her in over a year. She had moved south, he'd heard, away from the city, from the memories, from the wall. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "But also, I have something for you." Tuan hesitated. "For me?" "Yes, a letter. Written long ago. I found it while unpacking a box last week. It was from your father. I think he meant it for you." Tuan's breath stilled. "I don't understand." I didn't either. But he must have given it to me during one of our tenant meetings years ago. Said it was to be passed on if anything ever happened to him. I forgot. I'm so sorry. The next morning, a courier arrived. A small envelope, yellowed, folded over twice. No stamp, no name. Just a single line on the back. For Tuan, if he ever finds silence too heavy. His hands trembled. Inside, a note handwritten, faint ink, sharp strokes, his father's. "Contri, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I believe deeply that you will face something hard and stay. That you'll become the man who listens to pain, not runs from it. That you'll knock when others freeze. I don't know what wall you'll face, but I trust you'll know when to raise your hand. And when you do, let it be out of love, not fear. You were always more than you thought." Tuan read it again. and again. He didn't cry. Not yet. He placed the letter beside the journal. 3 voices now. 3 echoes. That evening, he lit a candle on the rooftop. No ceremony, just a small flame in the dusk. And he whispered to no one, to everyone, "I heard you." Somewhere below, someone turned off a light. Somewhere across the city, a window creaked open. And in the quiet that followed, Tuan imagined the world leaning closer, just enough to hear. The invitation came from the mountains. A teacher in Hajiang, remote, winding, green with mist, had heard about Nguoi Gongqua. She wrote a letter, not an email. Tuan read it 3 times. "Our school is small, no formal safety training, no internet. But we have children who ask good questions. Will you come?" He packed lightly. Dewey handed him a cloth-wrapped bundle. "For luck," he said, "and because I know you'll forget socks." The journey took hours, buses, footpaths, a final ride on the back of a motorbike, weaving through roads where clouds dipped below the treetops. The school stood like a promise, weathered, quiet, full of bright windows. The teacher, Ms. Thao, greeted him with a gentle bow. "They don't know your full story," she said, "only that you listen when others are afraid." That afternoon, Tuan stood before 20 children and a few elders. No projector, no whiteboard, just a circle of woven mats and a tin kettle steaming in the corner. He didn't start with the fire. He started with a knock. Lightly, he tapped the floor beside him. Then again, rhythmically, slowly. "What does that sound mean to you?" he asked. A boy raised his hand. "Rain." Another whispered, "Heartbeat." A third said, "Someone who wants in." Tuan smiled. They spoke of sound, not fear. Then he told the story, quietly, without drama, of a wall, of a voice, of staying even when everything said run. The room listened, not blinking. Afterward, a girl came up with a scrap of cloth. She had sewn a single word into it. "Lang, listen." Tuan folded it, placed it inside his notebook. That night, he sat beneath the stars, brighter here, unashamed, and thought of how far a knock could travel, not just across walls, but across hearts. The next morning, as he left, a boy called after him. "Uncle Tuan!" He turned. "If I get scared, can I knock?" Tuan smiled. "Yes," he said, "and someone will answer." Back in the city, the noise returned. Cars, voices, screens full of brightness and doubt. But he carried the cloth in his pocket, and each time the world got loud, he touched it and remembered the quiet places where courage learns to speak. The anniversary came quietly. 1 year since the fire. Tuan didn't plan anything. No ceremony, no media, no interviews. But as the day approached, people began to gather, not by invitation, but by instinct. First, Dewey reopened the cafe early and left all drinks free for anyone who's ever looked out for someone else. Then, a neighbor put candles along the edge of the alley, one for each household that now had a fire plan. By dusk, there were over 50. Children wrote messages in chalk on the pavement. "Thank you for staying." The wall remembers. "If I knock, will you hear me?" Tuan stood back, overwhelmed. Not with pride, with belonging. The feeling that this, all of this, had never been about him alone. It had always been about connection. He hadn't saved a life. He'd answered a sound. And in doing so, he'd reminded people of their own ability to respond. That night, someone brought a speaker. Music played softly, a low hum of strings and memory. A young woman from the safety program stood and asked, "Tuan, will you speak?" He hesitated, then nodded. He stepped forward, the alley lights brushing against his shoulders. "I didn't come here to be honored," he began. "I came here a year ago to ask a question." The crowd quieted. I asked it with my hands, against a wall, not knowing if anyone was left, not knowing if anyone would answer. But I knocked anyway. A breath. Then,